Night closed over Germany in the spring of 1945 like a heavy lid, and beneath it, the family of Hermann Göring entered a silence that history would never quite lift. The Reichsmarshal, once second only to Hitler, was already drifting toward his end, but the war did not stop with his death. It flowed onward into courtrooms, prison cells, ruined estates, and the private lives of those who carried his name. What happened to Göring's family after World War II was not a neat epilogue, but a long, unsettling unraveling, threaded with secrets, intelligence interrogations, psychological pressure, and the quiet violence of memory itself. When Göring surrendered to American forces in May 1945, he did so theatrically, arriving with trunks of uniforms, jewelry, and morphine hidden among his possessions. His wife Emmy and their daughter Edda were already separated from him by geography and by the collapsing order of the Third Reich. Emmy Göring, once the glamorous First Lady of Nazi Germany when Hitler needed a hostess, had fled with Edda into the Bavarian countryside as Allied bombers erased the familiar landmarks of their former world. The mountain air that had once promised safety now carried whispers of revenge and reckoning. She was no longer protected by titles or ceremonies. She was simply the wife of one of history's most hated men, waiting for the knock that would come sooner or later. The Americans understood something important as the war ended. The families of Nazi leaders were not just relatives, they were repositories of information, symbols to be broken, and psychological terrain to be mapped. Intelligence officers tracked Emmy Göring not because she commanded divisions or signed death warrants, but because she had been present in rooms where power spoke freely. She had heard confidences, seen the private weaknesses of men who ruled Europe through terror. When she was arrested in June 1945, it was not done with shouting or spectacle. It was done quietly, efficiently, with files already prepared, as if her life had been footnoted long before she was taken into custody. Edda Göring was just 7 years old then, a child whose earliest memories were of castles, uniforms, and whispered reverence. To the Allies, she was officially insignificant, yet symbolically potent. The daughter of the Reichsmarshal was a living reminder of how Nazism had wrapped itself in family imagery, pageantry, and false innocence. She was separated from her mother and placed in care, an act that would echo through her life with a sense of abandonment she would never quite articulate publicly. In intelligence terms, she was a closed file. In human terms, she was collateral damage. While Emmy and Edda disappeared into Allied custody and bureaucracy, Hermann Göring himself became the centerpiece of a new kind of warfare, one fought not with bombs, but with transcripts, surveillance, and psychological pressure. At Nuremberg, he was both defendant and performer, attempting to dominate the courtroom as he had once dominated the Luftwaffe. American psychologists studied him intensely, not out of admiration, but out of a desire to understand how charisma, addiction, and ideology fused into a weapon. What they learned would quietly inform Cold War interrogation techniques. Göring's family, meanwhile, became silent witnesses to this post-war transformation of knowledge into power. One of the least discussed figures in this story is Albert Göring, Hermann's younger brother, whose life after the war unfolded in stark contrast to the Reichsmarshal's legacy. Albert had used his famous surname during the war to save Jews and political prisoners, forging documents, bribing officials, and exploiting the fear attached to the Göring name to undermine the regime from within. When the war ended, Allied intelligence initially treated him as guilty by association. He was interrogated, detained, and suspected of being a cover for hidden Nazi networks. It took testimonies from those he had saved to prevent him from being consumed by his brother's shadow. Even then, he emerged into a Germany that offered little forgiveness and even less gratitude. Albert Göring's story circulated quietly among intelligence circles, not as propaganda, but as a case study in moral divergence. It troubled simple narratives of collective guilt and forced Allied authorities to confront uncomfortable truths, that resistance and complicity could exist within the same bloodline, that the war's moral geography was not as clean as victory speeches suggested. His survival did not redeem the Goring name, but it complicated it. adding a footnote that historians would rediscover decades later with a sense of disbelief. Back in captivity, Emmy Goring faced denazification tribunals that functioned as both legal process and moral theater. She insisted she had been merely a wife, an actress, a woman carried along by events beyond her control. Investigators countered with photographs, guest lists, transcripts of conversations held at Harrenhal, the Goring estate that had once been a shrine of plundered art and imperial fantasy. The estate itself had already been blown up on Goring's orders as the Red Army advanced, an act meant to deny enemies the satisfaction of occupation. What remained were ashes and documents, and in those documents, Emmy's proximity to power was unmistakable. Her sentence was not execution or life imprisonment, but years of internment and forced labor, followed by a classification that stripped her of wealth and status. The punishment was deliberately measured. The Allies had learned that martyrs were dangerous, that humiliation and quiet erasure were often more effective than dramatic retribution. Emmy Goring would not vanish completely. She would live on as a reduced figure, a reminder rather than a warning. When Hermann Göring swallowed a cyanide capsule on the night of October 15, 1946, just hours before his execution, the act rippled outward like a shockwave through his family's already fractured existence. For the Allies, it was a failure of security that prompted internal investigations and tighter controls on other prisoners. For his family, it was a final assertion of control from beyond the grave. He denied them closure, denied history its ritual ending, and ensured that his name would forever be associated not just with crimes, but with escape. Emmy learned of his death through official channels, in language stripped of emotion. There was no body to mourn publicly, no grave to visit. The psychological effect was profound. In later years, she would speak of the moment with a mixture of bitterness and resignation, as if acknowledging that Hermann Göring had always chosen spectacle over responsibility, even in death. Intelligence officers noted these reactions carefully, not because they expected actionable information, but because understanding the emotional aftershocks of power was part of understanding how future regimes might fracture. Etta Goring grew up in the long shadow of that name, a shadow that followed her into classrooms, job applications, and friendships. Post-war Germany wanted to rebuild itself through forgetting, but certain names resisted erasure. She was educated quietly, without privilege, yet never without suspicion. Teachers knew who she was. Classmates whispered. The daughter of the Reichsmarshal became an object lesson in inherited stigma, a living experiment in whether a society could separate a child from a father's crimes. As West Germany aligned itself with the emerging Cold War order, intelligence agencies on both sides took an interest in former Nazi families, not because they expected ideological revival, but because these families represented nodes of memory. Soviet intelligence, in particular, monitored them for signs of grievance that could be exploited. There is no evidence that Etta or Emmy were ever recruited or approached seriously, but files exist that track their movements, correspondence, and emotional state. The war, it seemed, was over only on the surface. Emmy Göring was released from internment in the early 1950s, older, poorer, and deeply disillusioned. She attempted to reclaim some of her confiscated property through legal channels, arguing technicalities and appealing to the courts of a Germany eager to move on. Most claims were rejected. The art, jewels, and estates that had once defined her life were gone, dispersed across museums, private collections, and state vaults. The loss was not just material, it was symbolic, the dismantling of an identity constructed on proximity to power. In private, Emmy remained loyal to her husband's memory, insisting on his intelligence, his charm, and his supposed ignorance of the worst crimes of the regime. These assertions were less about historical truth than about psychological survival. To fully accept Hermann Göring's guilt would have meant confronting her own complicity, her own enjoyment of a system built on suffering. Denial became a form of self-defense, one that historians would later recognize as common among the families of perpetrators. Etta, by contrast, developed a quieter, more ambiguous relationship with the past. As an adult, she gave few interviews, and when she did, her words were careful, restrained. She defended her father as a loving parent while avoiding direct engagement with his actions as a Nazi leader. This separation was not hypocrisy, it was survival strategy. Intelligence analysts studying post-war radicalization would later cite such psychological compartmentalization as a key factor in how extremist legacies persist without overt ideology. The Göring name faded from daily headlines, but it never fully disappeared from the undercurrents of historical research. As archives opened and classified files were declassified, a more complex picture emerged of how Allied intelligence had handled Nazi families. There were debates, memos, and disagreements over whether isolation or reintegration was the better strategy. The Görings became an unspoken case study, their lives used to test theories about guilt, memory, and the long-term consequences of total war. Albert Göring's later years were marked by poverty and obscurity. Despite his documented acts of resistance, he struggled to find stable work, his surname closing doors faster than testimonies could open them. He died in relative anonymity, a bitter irony that underscored one of the war's cruelest lessons, that moral courage does not always translate into post-war justice. His existence challenged the simplistic moral binaries that intelligence agencies and governments often preferred, and for that reason his story remained buried for decades. In the end, what happened to Hermann Göring's family after World War II was not redemption or damnation, but something more unsettling. They lived, they endured, they carried the weight of a name that history would not forgive in a world that alternated between condemnation and indifference. Their lives became quiet extensions of the war itself, shaped by interrogations that never fully ended, by files that were never completely closed, and by a past that refused to stay buried. The hidden dimension of their story lies not in secret bunkers or coded messages, but in the psychological terrain of aftermath. World War II did not end in 1945 for the Göring family, it simply changed form. It became a war of memory against forgetting, of identity against inheritance, of private grief against public history. In that sense, their story is not unique, but it is instructive. It reveals how the true aftermath of total war unfolds not in treaties, but in living rooms, court records, and the quiet choices of those left behind long after the guns have fallen silent.